Welcome back. This is Curiosity, Not Judgment. My name is Birga.
And I'm Gary.
So, our weekly format is always to put forward a topic, to discuss it, but hopefully the end result is really for you to analyze in your own world and in your own set of circumstances. Can you apply this curious subject matter in your own circumstance to lead towards better relationship? Because really that's what this is all about. And so I've had an experience over the last week or two that I'm sure many of you have had in varying degrees of seriousness, but it's the notion of being treated in a very unjust way. And there is no reconciliation that's going to come because of a policy that's in place, a rule that's been established, or just it is the way of the world. And when you are the victim of injustice that cannot be rectified, what do you do about it, and how do you keep yourself from going down a path of bitterness and resentment, and how do you keep from being kind of poisoned in mind and spirit because you know the action was wrong?
You know, when we are right and we know we're right, it's almost, I guess, when I used to play tennis competitively, I'd almost rather lose decisively than almost have made it. And so I guess where I'm going with that in the context of analogy I'm using is if you know you're right, it's almost worse than if you thought you might have had a little bit of a problem in it when the decision doesn't go your way, right? And so when you know you're right, you're almost in the worst kind of situation because it can really eat at you and really kind of be discouraging when you know you're right and things just didn't work out. As you know, and as anybody who's been listening for a long time knows, I did my 4 years in government. I say as penance, but in reality, I chose it, and I wanted to see how the other half lives. And you know, oftentimes it's really good if you're. I did this at Intel. I was in engineering, and I just couldn't understand why these manufacturing folks couldn't, you know, make this perfectly designed product. And then, you know, someone challenged me one time. Well, why don't you go into manufacturing and see if you could do it? And I wanted to see how the other half lives. Government is set up to reduce risk to zero, reduce behavior variation to zero, and to put in place policies that in fairness are usually well motivated to promote a public policy, but by definition, it can't be perfect. You cannot do it right. But the big frustration for me was there's no feedback loops. If something's not working, then we should modify it. And what about the outliers? And unfortunately, in the situation of government, and this goes to schools and other institutions, large bureaucratic institutions, they kind of, in general, and I'm generalizing here, I know, have to put in certain rules and boundaries. Otherwise, in their mind, the work becomes untenable. I have to have this set of structure. And the outliers, I'm sorry, there's going to be a few, but otherwise we cannot function, is the view, right or wrong. So if you're one of those outliers and you say, yeah, but I've got this situation, and you should have a system with the proper feedback loops and allowing for this situation. And I'll bet it isn't the first time. One of my favorite things is, I bet that I'm not the only one that has this problem, or I'm not the only one in this situation. And you know, this is not the intended consequence that you're after here.
Right.
And generally, I find that in my experience, that falls on deaf ears.
Oh, yeah.
So what do you do about that?
Right. And sometimes the answer is you can't do anything about it. And I think that's really where I want to go with this, is when you can't do anything about it, then what? And how do you guard your heart against bitterness, and how do you not let this become a source of contention that shifts the trajectory of your life? Because again, you know, based on seriousness of whatever the injustice is, this could have dire consequences. I can think of a very light example off the top of my head, which, had no long-term consequences, but could have impacted me in a negative way. And it's a simple story. When I was a senior in high school, I went up for homecoming court. And every year there had been 13 couples, or 13 women, 13 men on homecoming court. And that particular year, I was number 13. But this decision was made by the whoever, counselor, I don't know who makes these decisions. Like, we're just going to have 12 on court this year. Like, what? I was 13. I was last. I was dead last, but I was 13. And I felt so cheated. I felt so wronged. And yet, there was nothing for me to do about it. What am I going to do? Petition the council board and petition the principal? I mean, I guess I could have.
These days you would.
Yeah, these days. That was long enough ago.
Yeah.
I just, had to suffer the consequences of the decision. But I felt like I was treated unjustly. And so, could I have let that sour my entire senior year? I sure could have. Some people, that's what it's all about, is the election to office, on the school council, or promotion within a sports team, or whatever the case may be. And when you don't get that validation, it ruins everything. And so that's an example that doesn't have extreme consequences, but there are examples that do have extreme consequences and can absolutely alter the course of your future. And so when you have a ruling that's made, you are treated unjustly, the answer is, against you. How do you move forward without bitterness?
Well, and there's so much in what you just said here. Let me start with a couple of comments. Number one is, you've heard the flap of a butterfly wing. There's several science fiction stories and what ifs that go through about, if you were to have a time machine, you went back and you stepped on a spider, and that changes the current president when you go back to, because one thing leads to another. So
Sure.
I think it's interesting your examination of this story of this was a small thing. One person's small thing is another person's big thing.
True.
And sometimes a little thing can change the entire course of history, which is kind of interesting. So, but on the other hand, how injustice occurs in our lives and in institutions constantly, by definition. We all try to, reduce that as much as possible. And I think that's everyone's intent. Unless they're in power and they like power and they'd like to wield that power and make it even greater, which also happens frequently and in every civilization ever. But what do you do personally so that it doesn't affect you negatively, I think is a really good question. And, many years ago, I was introduced to something called the Serenity Prayer. And the Serenity Prayer says that there are certain things that I can have control on and certain things I can. So it's, God grant me the serenity to change the things I can, accept the things I cannot, and the wisdom to know the difference. And so, those are three easy lines to say and much harder things to do.
To live out, yeah.
But if you can accept the things that you cannot change the things you can, and then have the wisdom to know what the difference is, I think that can go a long way toward at least a personal peace about those things. You described a situation in leading this off that you have said, and so I believe you, cannot be changed. So if that's the case, that's in the category of I must accept the things I cannot change. And when you say must accept, that is sometimes very hard to do, but what's the choice?
Yeah.
What's the alternative?
So I'll give you an example of a dire consequence of an injustice. I had a conference that I was at, and a mother was sharing the story about her son. Her son was a Marine. He was on leave and went to a bar to meet a girl that he had, been having some degree of communication with. And they're having a great time at the bar. an ex-boyfriend of the girl comes in and begins to be very, very aggressive towards the woman. And the Marine says, let's go outside. You got to leave her alone. And the conversation gets heated. It starts to escalate. And the Marine does one punch to the guy's face, does the nose break thing, and he was killed. The decision of the court was he was trained to kill as a service member, as a Marine, and therefore he should have known better. He should have known the implications. And in the state they were in, it was that, there was somehow no appeal. I don't know all the legal situations surrounding it, but I trust the mom that they went through every possible fight to secure her son's freedom. And the end result was life in prison, no chance for parole. So you've got now a 24-year-old or however old he was at the time that has his entire life altered in defense of a woman that he was interested in, that was being, I'm going to say, bullied or abused, harassed by somebody else. He was standing up and defending. And so in this case, there's nothing to be done. And so she goes on to talk about the grief, the deep grief that they went through, that she as a mother went through, that he went through, the depression, all of the things that you have to process. And then they had to come to a decision, both as individuals and as a family. Like, this is what life looks like now. And now what are we going to do about it? And the decision that was made in that season, we are going to serve. As a mother, she was going to serve her son. She was going to, routinely come and be a presence at the prison. The son was going to choose to serve within the prison walls. And the things that happened and the lives that were transformed were amazing. And it was this testimony of just transformation in circumstances you would never wish on anyone. And yet, really beautiful things came from it. And so I bring this up because I do think we have the opportunity to shine even in the midst of extreme injustice.
Absolutely. And that's a great story. And I think that goes toward part of that serenity prayer, acceptance of the things I cannot change. And now what?
Yeah, and now what?
And I think that's the question. And now what? You can never get to and now what if you never accept.
Yeah, that's important.
Because otherwise, you're just trying to reverse the decision and beating your head against the wall, and it's probably never going to happen. And that will absolutely lead to bitterness and a vicious spiral. Because nothing good can come from that. And I'm not saying don't appeal an injustice, but the point is, if you accept the current circumstance, then you can get to the question, and now what? And how can I lead and serve in this circumstance? Whereas if you don't accept it, you can never get to that, and now what? And you spend your whole life on appeal, even if it's not going to happen.
Well, and I want to clarify that acceptance doesn't mean you agree with the decision.
No.
But I think that needs to be said, because when you say, well, I accept the decision of the court, or I accept the whatever, there might be a conception, or a misconception rather, that you somehow have had a heart change and you come into an agreement, and that doesn't have to be the case. What I remember a conversation I had with somebody about the phrase, it is what it is. And he said to me, I hate that phrase. He said, what I want to say instead is, it is what you make of it. And this gentleman ended up writing a book about this topic, and he gave a presentation that I was privy to, and I found it pretty fascinating, because those are really different postures. To say, well, it is what it is, and I'm going to just go forward, and it may include bitterness and resentment and all those things, but it is what you make of it sets you up on a different trajectory, I believe, to say, okay, this injustice has happened. I've accepted that it's happened in my life, and that there's not going to be an external force to change the situation. So now what do I do with the hand I've been dealt?
I love the is what it is make it, because choice is such a big deal. And we can grow up in certain circumstances. We can have certain DNA. Look, I battle cholesterol. And there's that it's a DNA thing. Every Opidol male is fine till they're 38, and then their cholesterol goes to 280. It's in my genes, right? And so I can choose to mitigate the other risks of diet, exercise, and stress. And sometimes some could argue about how much you can actually really have on stress. I can absolutely, I can either resign to it and do nothing, or I can accept that my family has and I can do diet and exercise until it doesn't work anymore and get on a statin. But I have choices, and choice is never taken away from you. Your circumstances may be determined, but your choice never is. And I think that's the big deal out of these stories, is that you always have a choice. And I think that's the thing that people can't take away from you, is how you respond and what choices you make as a result of the circumstances or the DNA or the whatever. I think there's a lot of folks who sell themselves short and never reach their potential or never start what I would call a virtuous cycle that can lead to some modicum of joy, happiness, and contentment, because the choice they make is to wallow in the determined path, either by DNA or environment.
Yeah. I've got a good friend who does injections for people in their home that have end-stage cancer that are, well, I guess I shouldn't say end-stage cancer, and they're being treated at home with various drugs. And so she's a nurse, and she goes and does the injections and the medication balancing that they need. And what I was fascinated to hear from her was a vast majority of the patients that she's treating that are end-stage, like in the high 90 percentile, are all very joyful people that genuinely want to have conversation and engage and know how she's doing, and they have a radiance about them, and their circumstance doesn't look great, right? They're receiving drugs that probably make them feel terrible, that may or may not have a chance of killing the cancer in their body, and yet they've chosen to make a choice in their circumstance that they are going to have their end days be one of joy and relationship and engagement, and not bitterness and self-pity. And I was amazed to hear that number, but it encouraged me in that, there's going to be times when something really terrible happens in your life. And when you know that you can't change the circumstance, you can change your mind.
No question. And as we've talked about on this podcast before, I had a terminal cancer diagnosis at one point in my life. And there was a time, and I went through all the stages of grief and anger and all that kind of stuff. But then I went into, engineering research mode, which is my personality, about, okay, I'm gonna do everything I can to fix it. But along the way, I had to make some decisions. Am I going to be bitter? Am I going to be angry? Am I going to try to make everybody else's life around me miserable because mine is coming to an end? And I feel bad for this treatment or whatever, so I'm going to make everybody else feel pain too. Or am I going to try to, light up every room I come into? Am I going to try to be a positive influence? Am I going to try to have those conversations? So your friend's story doesn't surprise me. I found an amazing amount of people who were very engaged in those rooms, waiting for all the countless tests and all the things that you have to go through in that situation. But I will tell you, you also see the ones that aren't handling it well. And that was the euphemism for they were becoming bitter. And I would also submit that the survival rate of the people who decided to be a light and to think about others and to try to cause joy was much higher than the people who had given up and were just going to be bitter.
Absolutely. And I would say cancer is an injustice, right?
That's true.
It is. It's unfair in every possible way that you look at it. It's unfair. And yet, there's very little that you can do, well, one might argue, very little that you can do to prevent this thing from happening. And so, that decision of how am I going to handle the rest of my life, whether it be short or long, knowing that this unfair thing has happened to me, And I think that really gets to the heart of what this conversation is all about. When the unfair happens, when the injustice comes, when you are the victim of a ruling, of a situation, of a regulation that isn't right, and you can't do anything about it, what is your outcome going to be based on the way that you choose to live out your life after that?
Well, and back to that serenity prayer, and I think I misquoted it, but it's the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I'm glad that reoccurred to me in the proper form, because that courage to change what I can often comes after the realization of being in a situation and accepting that you can't. Because it does take courage when you've been diagnosed with cancer to be a light and lively person.
Yeah.
It does take courage to say, I'm in this jail cell, I think unjustly, for the rest of my life. What can I choose? The courage to change the things I can made all the difference in that story, which is why it's a story that people still tell today.
Absolutely. If the story was, well, he was locked up for the rest of his life and was pissed off.
Situation normal.
Yeah.
It takes courage to do different things.
It does. Absolutely. So, do you have the courage to change your outlook when you are faced with injustice? We'll leave that with you to contemplate. And if you've got some feedback, we'd love to hear it. So feel free to drop a comment, or if you want to get in touch with us through the website, there's an opportunity to do that as well. curiositynotjudgment.com. And we will catch up with you next week.
Take care.